We're going to be in Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 46. Mark chapter 10, verse 46. A couple of things going on this week that you might want to add to your prayer list. Linda's in-laws and outlaws are chasing cattle this weekend, spring roundup. So that's always fun and a little bit dangerous. So keep that family in your prayers. Michael is getting ready to leave to go to Austin with Heather Wood. Did you say 16 years? It's been 16 years since we've had a UIL state competitor, and Heather is going this year and Michael is going with her. So remember them in your prayers, that they will have a safe and fun trip and that Heather will do well in her competition. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the event that we're going to look at this morning, the healing of a man at Jericho. Matthew mentions that there were more than one that were sitting there together, blind men along the road outside of Jericho. Luke includes another encounter in Jericho that we're going to look at next week, a fellow named Zacchaeus. Maybe you remember him. He was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. We'll talk about him a little bit more next week. But Mark's focus is on this man named Bartimaeus. So let's start reading in verse 46. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means Son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and he came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." And immediately he received his sight and he followed Jesus along the road. One of the ways that you can always tell that Mark was writing for a Gentile audience is that he interprets things for us that Matthew does not. Matthew was mainly writing to a Jewish audience, Mark more to a Gentile audience. When he gives us this man's name, he says his name was Bartimaeus. Bar in Hebrew is the son of. So he is the son of Timaeus. And it got me to thinking, it's very seldom, in fact, I didn't actually come up with an example, that we get the name of the people who are healed in the New Testament. Think about that one for a minute. We get identities, but we don't get names. We've got Jairus' daughter. We've got the nobleman's son. We've got the man at the pool of Bethesda. We've got the widow's son at Nain, but we don't get any names. Even this one is Bartimaeus, and it seems like we've gotten ourselves a name, and Mark says, well, that just means his daddy's name was Timaeus. So we know his dad's name, but we don't actually know his. I finally decided that maybe Lazarus might count, but Lazarus didn't get healed. He got raised from the dead. Is getting raised from the dead the same as getting healed? Y'all have to judge that one out for yourself. Jesus didn't heal him on purpose so he could raise him from the dead, but at least we do know Lazarus' name. Well, let's first just lay out the facts as we have them. Jesus was traveling in the area of Jericho, and if you know your Old Testament, you know that Jericho was the first place to get destroyed when they invaded Canaan in about 1400 BC or so, when the children of Israel finally crossed across the Jordan River and began the invasion of Canaan. It's one of the oldest and most fertile settlements in all of that area. In fact, it's one of the oldest settlements on the planet. They can trace that one back to, as far back as you can trace civilization, there seems to have been a place civilized or settled around Jericho. And again, it had been destroyed and rebuilt on several different occasions. And as usual, there were lots of people around. Anywhere Jesus went, particularly in this part of his ministry, there were people following him because they knew exactly what he could do. Some were beginning to catch on to the idea of who he was. And if you were sick, if you had an ailment and you knew Jesus was going to be somewhere nearby, you would do your best to get to where he was. Think about people who gather on street corners in large metropolitan areas. When we would go to see Mother and Daddy, of course Daddy's moved out of the house now, but just short of where they lived, there is Jim Miller Road exit off of Highway 30. And when you would exit off of Highway 30, there would always be someone standing there with a sign. I need help. And so as you came off and stopped at that intersection ready to turn one way or the other, there would always be someone there. In the West End district of Dallas, there's a lot of restaurants, a lot of nightlife, and a lot of people. And because there's a lot of people, there's a lot of folks who panhandle down there. They know that that's a place that they might be able to get the things that they need. So as this huge crowd is coming by, Bartimaeus and others like him were sitting beside the road as they usually would, and they were crying out for help from the different ones that passed them by. But as soon as Bartimaeus learns that Jesus is close by, he refuses to stop yelling until Jesus pays attention to him. I really like Bartimaeus, but I really don't like people who approach you when you're trying to go to the restaurant in a busy part of Dallas. Same group of people, right? So, sometimes we become so involved in our own little worlds that we forget what was going on in Jesus' world, but this is the same scenario. This is a guy who has no visible means of taking care of himself, and he's really been begging every day for as long as he can remember. But now Jesus is coming to town, and he's got somebody that he knows can do something about his situation. And perhaps the most important part of the account, why does Jesus ask the man what he wants? Did you notice that? It seems kind of obvious. You've got a blind man sitting by the side of the road, and he begins to cry out to you, and when they bring him to you, you are God of heaven and earth made flesh. You know what the man's problem is. Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Hang on to that. That's an important question. Let's take a minute to look at the bigger picture. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. This is his final ascent back up toward the holy city. Jericho is down in the river valley near the Jordan, and from there it's uphill all the way. When you finally get up to Jerusalem, you're at a high point. If you've still got your Bible open, you might look at the beginning of chapter 11 in Mark. If not, just take my word for it. The first thing that happens when you get to chapter 11 is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus is within a couple of weeks of his crucifixion and resurrection. He's going to be murdered by the leadership of his people. He's going to be abandoned by his disciples. And so for centuries, there have been books written, articles published about the Son of Timaeus, this blind guy who could see more clearly than the people around him, who had physical sight but no spiritual understanding. He was at the bottom of the food chain. You couldn't get much lower than being a blind man sitting on the side of the road having to beg for the next meal that you ate. He had no power. He had no influence. All he had was the outside chance that Jesus would do something for him. The scribes and the elders of the people up the hill were at the top of the heap. They got what they wanted when they wanted it. They told people what to do, and the people did what they said. While he was certainly blind physically, he knew something that a lot of people in that crowd had not yet figured out. When he calls out to Jesus, he does not call out, "Hey, Jesus of Nazareth, would you come over here and help me? I need some help. Hey, Jesus, I've heard that you know how to do some amazing things. Can you come help me?" He yells out, "Jesus, Son of David." He calls him the Messiah. Before Jesus ever goes to Jerusalem, before Jesus ever goes to the cross, before Jesus is ever raised from the dead, this guy knows who Jesus is. The next time we run across this language is when Jesus is going into Jerusalem in the triumphal entry, and the people along the way are saying hallelujah to the Father, and they're screaming out, "Blessed is the one that comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the Son of David." But the blind guy, he already knows, he already understands that Jesus is different. And so he calls him out not by his name, but by his title. "You are the Son of David. You are the Messiah." But maybe more importantly than that, he may have known that Jesus was Messiah, but he also knew that he was blind. He got the picture that he had a problem, and he knew what to ask for. When Jesus poses the question, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus is not at a loss. He didn't have to make a list and cull it down and come up with the right answer to this question. When Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus says, "I want to see. It's what I've always wanted. It's what I've known all my life that I needed, and finally I have the answer to my question." The leadership at Jerusalem were convinced that their vision, both physically and spiritually, was crystal clear. And they didn't need a thing. If Jesus had asked them the same question, "What can I do for you?" their answers would have ranged from "Go home and shut up" to "Die." And die is the answer they gave. It almost seems laughable, though, to ask a blind guy what he wants. Did he just ask him that to get him to say it out loud? In counseling, I've learned that people have a lot of things going on in their hearts and in their minds that they never say out loud. And if you can get them on the right subject and get them to talking and they say it out loud, it almost surprises them when they hear themselves say it. You ever been in that situation? You're just talking along and all of a sudden something comes out and you're like, "Wait a minute, I didn't mean to actually say that out loud. I didn't mean for somebody else to hear that. I'm not really sure that that's true. Wait just a minute, let me think about it. Yeah, that really is true. I need to do something about that." And so sometimes in counseling, if you could just get them to say it out loud, it helps. But I don't think that's the reason Jesus asked the question. The answer seems simple. It's the question that's the key. Go back over to Mark 10 and verse 35. I want you to see something kind of neat. I hadn't noticed this before. Chapter 10, verse 35. "James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do for us whatever we ask.' And Jesus said, 'What do you want me to do for you?'" Does that sound familiar? James and John come to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" What do James and John want? We want to be at the top of the heap. We want one of us to sit on your right hand and one of us to sit on your left hand when you come into your glory. And Jesus says, "Well, that's my Father's decision. That's not for me to decide." But then he goes on down the road and there's this guy yelling, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And he says, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" And he says, "I just want to see." What a gap, Right? James and John, we've got it all together. We've got it all figured out. We know what's going on. Just put one of us on your right, one of us on your left. Bartimaeus, I just want to see. Give me the gift that I can't possibly hope to gain on my own. Let's do one more. Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. Mark chapter 8. In verse 22. It's another blind man. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside of the village. When he spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home and said, "Don't even go into the village." That's one of my least favorite miracles. I've always thought that's just the goofiest, Jesus says, do it, and it happens. Right? The other man that he spit on the ground, he made mud out of the spittle, put it on his eyes, and said, "Go wash your eyes out in the pool of Siloam." The guy goes and washes his eyes, and he comes back seeing. That's the kind of miracle I'm used to. Jesus just says it, and it happens. This halfway, I see men, but they kind of look like trees. That's what happens when I do that. I got that part of the miracle. When Jesus says, "What do you see?" and the man says, "Well, it's just kind of fuzzy. It's not clear." And Jesus touches him a second time, and then he can see. And I've always thought that's an odd miracle. Why didn't Jesus just heal him completely the first time? You end up with a really cool illustration for what's going on in the lives of some other people. And I don't know that that's why Jesus did it that way, but I do know that it works out well. First of all, there's a guy like Bartimaeus who knows he's blind. He knows what to ask for, and he knows who to ask. And so he receives his sight from Jesus the Messiah. I was watching different videos this week in preparation for this sermon. And David, this is one you ought to put in your mental bank. You watch a lot of sermons. This fellow's name is Alistair Begg. He is Scottish, and come for the accent, stay for the lesson. He's fun to listen to, but a wonderful message. And at the end of his message, he said this, and I want to quote it to you. Alistair Begg: "You will never know Jesus Christ as a reality in your life until you know him as a necessity." You will never know him as a reality until you know him as a necessity. And so you've got blind Bartimaeus, who is absolutely in the situation of necessity. I can't do anything about what's going on with me. I have to have help in my situation. Then you have the disciples, who were a lot like the man who saw people like trees. Their vision was better than most of the folks around them when it came to Jesus. They understood some things about Jesus and about his ministry, but it still wasn't really clear. They were still asking for things like, "Well, let one of us sit on your right hand and one of us sit on your left." They thought they had things figured out, but they still had a cloudy vision. And then, of course, there were the rulers at Jerusalem, who were so blind they didn't even know what they needed to ask for. They were blind enough to do exactly what mankind needed them to do all along. Ever since Adam and Eve, God had been moving toward this moment in time. Some people saw clearly physically, but not so clearly spiritually. Some people saw clearly spiritually, but were blind physically. And Jesus was walking through this corridor of people on all sides with all levels of ability to understand and to see what was going on, so that he could get to Jerusalem, so that he could die on the cross, so that you and I could have a vision that we never would have known otherwise. He went to die for you and me so that you and I could see, so that we could get right with the Father, so that we could enjoy our eternity with him. So I guess the question that Jesus would ask us today, what is it that you want me to do for you? What is it that you need? Do you know that you need it? And if you know that you need it, are you willing to shout it to the rooftops until I give it to you? Are you willing to fight to get an audience with me so I can give you the healing that you desire? Are you a Bartimaeus? Are you like the disciples and you think you've kind of got it figured out? And you think maybe that you've already got the kingdom all locked up? Maybe you're on the outside looking in like the leaders at Jerusalem and you just don't have a clue why people follow Messiah. But he asks you the question all the same. What is it that Jesus can do for you? If you know the answer to that question and you'd like to share it with us, we're going to sing a song. And as we're singing that song, if you'll come down here and let us know what it is that you need, we'll help you get right with God through Jesus Christ. As we stand and sing.